Okay. למען אחי ורעי, למען אחי ורעי, אדברה נא, שלום בך, למען אחי ורעי, למען אחי ורעי, אדברה נא, שלום בך, למען בית השם אלוקינו אבקשה טוב לך, למען בית השם אלוקינו אבקשה טוב לך. Because of my brothers and friends, because of my brothers and friends, please let me ask, please let me sing peace to you. Because of my brothers and friends, because of my brothers and friends, please let me ask, please let me sing peace to you. This is the house of the Lord. I wish the best for you. This is the house of the Lord. I wish the best for you.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vrettos. I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York City. In the original Greek meaning, the word philanthropy is defined as love for humanity. Anyone could be a philanthropist, regardless of their status or net worth. All you needed was a desire to make life better for others. In America, however, more often than not, philanthropists are viewed as coming from the donor classes, are captains of industry and finance, or occupy seats of privilege in political, religious, cultural, and even military power. They're seen as generously and altruistically bestowing part of their wealth to help the less fortunate, providing services and institutions for the public good that it couldn't otherwise afford. Their beneficence and virtue should be acknowledged, respected, and honored. Today on the show, we look at the far more complicated historical reality of the changing and uneasy relationship among philanthropy, democracy, and capitalism. We'll be exploring the history of American Jewish philanthropy as it tried to balance the interests of democracy with those of capitalism, the interests of the public good versus the need for capitalism to grow and profit. How did the American Jewish philanthropic complex emerge in an American state increasingly committed to having democracy invest in private capitalistic interests? How did the love of humanity become the love of the scam and greed of a Bernie Madoff and many others, structured into the system? The financialization of American philanthropy through various tax policies, financial vehicles for holding and investing philanthropic capital, new investment and endowment policies, all empowered the philanthropic sector, especially its biggest donors. They act with only the most perfunctory and casual regard for the public as economic inequality continues to grow in the country. Miracle of miracles, irony of ironies, dollar for dollar, the state and the public largely subsidize American and Jewish philanthropic interests today through tax deductions and exemptions. Private interests command authority over the public good, and democratic interests in American life, in American Jewish life, and beyond. Our guest today on The Radical Imagination is Lila Corwin Berman, professor of history and the Murray Friedman Chair of American Jewish History at Temple University. She's written a brave, masterfully researched new book called The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex, The History of a Multi-Billion-Dollar Institution. It's the first comprehensive history on the subject. It singles a critical challenge for Jewish studies as a whole, questions how wealth is amassed in the American neoliberal state, and confronts the role of Jewish values, complicity, and integration within it. I've been wanting to do this show on this topic for many years. It's been a long wait, but worth it now that Lila's book is out. It's the most important and definitive one we have on the subject so far. So Lila, thank you so very, very much for being here for the show. And your book is absolutely terrific. Here it is. And thank you again for being here and to dialogue with us on this important topic.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. So let me start by actually quoting from the first page of your book here. The ubiquity of philanthropy in American life and American Jewish life. You point out, not a single day in my life passes untouched by philanthropy. The same is true for most Americans, whether they recognize it or not. Almost any person who affiliates with the American Jewish community could make a similar accounting for the benefits they have reaped from Jewish philanthropy. So, Lila, then what is the issue? What are some of your concerns? We think of, right, we have this romanticized vision of philanthropy, plant a tree in Israel, was it Brighton Beach Memoirs, Woody Allen movie, where little child Woody Allen goes through the streets of Brighton Beach there with the can for the National Jewish Fund, correct? And if I remember correctly, he also took some of the money out and did other things. But that's another story. Maybe Woody knew something there too. Anyway, not to be, but start us off on this. What is your major concern in this book?
So in a sense, my major concern was exactly the fact that philanthropy, as I say on that first page, was so ubiquitous in my own life and ubiquitous in the lives of almost every American, and certainly almost every American Jew. And yet I had given very little thought to it. It seemed natural. It just seemed the way that things were, that there was this money that was not my own money, and that was not the money, that was in the kind of public domain through the state, through taxation. And it was provisioning for things in my life. And I had never given a huge amount of thought to it. And when I started to try to account for just what that figure was, it was pretty spectacular. And that led me to very basic historical question, which is, how has this state of being emerged, and what does it tell us about the way that power operates? Certainly generosity, altruism, all of those words that, when you go and you read in the history of Jewish philanthropy, tend to come across. There tend to be studies of particular institutions, or very celebratory studies about generosity and about giving and charity, or tzedakah in Hebrew. That was the narrative. And it wasn't a narrative that also looked at, how is all of this money amassed? How is it designated as philanthropic? And what kinds of political and economic power travel with that designation? How has a system that seems so natural that we don't even think about it, how has that system actually participated in the most important shifts in economic life and in political life in the 20th century?
Right. I'm glad you touched on it, because Jewish charity in particular comes from biblical injunctions, right? To help the poor, the widow, the needy. So it has religious roots. So make the transition, mutual aid societies and so on, make the transition to the American experience again. Trace that history for us a little bit.
Yeah, and that's really important, right? There could be a book written about Jewish philanthropy in the United States that really roots it in that context, in biblical statements, and then how rabbis interpreted those statements, how different kinds of Jewish leaders throughout the centuries thought about what it meant to provision for a group of people who tended not to be living under their own political rule. So that is something, I think, that is worth thinking about. But to my way of understanding what it is that emerged in the 20th century and in the United States, the much more important force for thinking about the actual contours of American Jewish philanthropy came from the landscape of the American state, came from the landscape of policies and political thought from the early Republic up through, into the middle of the 20th century, that really was grappling with, what do you do with the groups of people that are not quite the public and not quite the private, not the individual citizens and not the government? How can that kind of associational space between the state and the individual be governed, be disciplined, be supported? What kinds of policies should be put into place to allow some kind of balance of, the kind of space that exists, the public-private, what we now think of as the kind of nonprofit. And I think if we look at American Jewish philanthropy in a kind of clear-sighted way, we might understand that a longer heritage from Jewish traditional texts and different places in Jewish history matters. But to the actual kind of mechanisms of how American Jewish philanthropy work, the American state policies and different kinds of kind of political theories and action really, really matter, I would argue, a great deal more.
Right. I like the way you put it in your book here, the embeddedness of Jewish philanthropy within the political economy of the American state. You talked about the balance. Did we ever have much of that balance between, again, Jewish philanthropy, the larger American philanthropic enterprise? Was there a balance ever?
Well, so the kind of tension that I set out, that I think you're referring to, is a kind of basic tension between capitalism and democracy, right? So if we have this sort of idea that each person should be represented in the political life of a society, of a nation, each person should be enfranchised to have a voice, and that's the point of citizenship, and that's how democracy works. What do we do, on the other hand, with a different kind of ideology that talks about people's ability to amass profit, to amass capital, to invest that profit and capital to make more, thus valuing certain goods and in individuals more so than others? What kind of power, what kind of modes of control does capitalism offer that could be ultimately undermining of democracy, right? So there's this kind of basic tension, and I think that it can be a kind of creative or productive tension sometimes. But one of the ways that political theorists envision philanthropy is sort of being able to balance that tension. So in a sense, taking the excesses of capitalism and distributing them or redistributing them in a way that can vitalize or revitalize democracy. I would say that is a kind of ideal type sort of scenario for what capitalism actually, how it can kind of rest more easily with democracy. And so the question for me became kind of the big think question of this book became, is philanthropy doing that kind of balancing? Or has it kind of tipped the scales in one direction or another? And an even bigger question is this ideal type even actually a possibility, right? Is it possible that philanthropy, which I think it's, pretty impossible to imagine philanthropy existing without being a creature of the fact that there is wealth inequality, is it possible that philanthropy can actually be an aid for democracy?
Let me ask you this, Lila. What are some of the prophetic Jewish voices? What can we learn from them? What side, if you will, do they come down on? What can we learn from that prophetic tradition, even today?
Well, I'm not sure what kinds of voices you're asking in terms of prophetic, right? So if we're thinking in very traditional ways, there are certainly, in traditional Jewish texts, prophetic voices that talk about the importance of, not aggrandizing oneself because of wealth, the importance of understanding that material wealth itself, is really an illusion and it's not a proxy for goodness or for merit. On the other hand, there are traditional Jewish texts that talk exactly about people who, because of their goodness or merit, suddenly, like overnight, become wealthy, right? There's certain figures in Talmudic stories that are rewarded with wealth because of their goodness, and you can see a kind of slippage between goodness and wealth. In terms of some of the maybe more contemporary prophetic-like voices, I do think about a figure like Julius Rosenwald, and I think there's no prophet who we should think of as just purely, a force of good necessarily. Julius Rosenwald was a complicated figure in the early 20th century, made a great deal of money in Chicago with Sears Roebuck, and was, able to eventually amass a lot of money and decided that he wanted to do something good with that money and operate sort of philanthropically. And he started to test these ideas. He was looking around him and seeing people like Rockefeller and Carnegie and their desires to create these perpetual foundations with their capital. And he was very critical of that because he saw that desire to create immortality through one's quote unquote generosity, but through one's sort of perpetual philanthropic name, as ultimately a sort of false consciousness about the control one could have even after one passed away. And his contribution to the conversation was really to say that, whatever money that he was able to designate to operate for the public good, to operate philanthropically, needed to be time bound. And he wrote in a really stern way that we should not bind the future to whatever we think the solutions of our present are right now, and that there are plenty of present problems that we should be worrying about, and we shouldn't be kind of warehousing money, which it was akin to warehousing a kind of power for the future, to bind the future to what our imagination is. Now, he, obviously was a complicated figure. He gave a lot of money to building schools in the South, specifically schools for Black Americans, and, worked to get Black communities to invest in those schools, worked to get the government to invest in those schools, was really kind of seeing philanthropy as a sort of convener, but also had ideas that I think we could rightly say were quite paternalistic about what it meant to educate Black young people in the South at that time. But I do think that his insight about the ways in which money, philanthropically designated money, exercises as a form of control, especially when it has the ability to kind of pronounce itself as immortal, as perpetual. The reason I think it was prophetic is because he basically has predicted exactly what has happened with the growth of endowment-based philanthropy, with the growth of the idea that money should somehow exist perpetually, no matter what it might be able to be solving today if it weren't kind of warehoused in these endowments.
Let me ask the question, is Bernie Madoff an outlier? Or has the Jewish community really delved into its own relationship with him? Or are they're more or less ending their soul searching and going on as business as usual?
You know, it's interesting because obviously he just passed away. And so there was a sort of raft of articles that came out. And it was an appealing thesis, I think. And I talked to some journalists who were writing these articles. It was an appealing thesis to say, you know, what a reckoning it was. There was a crash in 2008 and the recession, and Bernie Madoff was part of that. And it caused this kind of soul searching. From the research that I've done and the kind of analysis I've done, I have to say, I just don't think very much changed after him. I mean, look, obviously, people's lives were harmed by the crime that he committed, right? So that's absolutely the case, and that cannot be denied. But the kind of reckoning that might have taken place, you know, for example, is it healthy to be so reliant on so few mega donors? Is it healthy not to ask some questions like, why are there so few people who control so much capital? How do our own communal practices sanction that? What kinds of means of reform might we have? Even if we're not talking on the largest level of American economic policy, how could we think about supporting our institutions without this incredible reliance on so few individuals? All sorts of questions that might have been asked. I don't think they were asked. I mean, yes, I think that most nonprofits decided it was very important to do more due diligence when it came to thinking about, you know, how endowments were invested. You know, I think some of them really professionalized some of their practices and were trying to hedge risk in an appropriate way. But the larger kind of questions about what is this economic structure? What does it mean to tie philanthropy so firmly into a form of capitalism? Like, look, you know, Madoff committed a crime, right? But there's lots of stuff that happens just on this side of legal that is not necessarily criminal, but that is really debilitating to the general public good of the most people. So what does it mean to tie philanthropy so closely to that? I don't think that kind of reckoning really happened.
Right. It's not happening and did not happen. Right. Well, your book hopefully will address some of those people. And actually, what I want to ask you, because you know there's going to be some pushback on some of the things you've been writing. So tell me how you set up the framework for your book, the research, the meticulous documentation, because that's very important as people are going to be responding to your book.
Yeah, so, you know, I'm a historian, right? So my imagination sort of begins and ends in archives. And when I started to think about, you know, what it was that I wanted to understand about the development and changes, transformations in American Jewish philanthropy, I started to look at some of the late 19th and early 20th century important Jewish philanthropic organizations. I knew I didn't want to tell an institutional history about one particular institution, but I wanted to understand what we can think of almost as the financial technologies, right? What were the practices? What were the kinds of rules and tools that they were using to do what they were doing? So I, you know, went to the archives of some of the earliest Jewish federations, which were umbrella charitable structures like United Ways that would centrally collect a lot of money for a particular locale, for a particular city, and then disperse that money to different agencies. And I read stuff that, you know, I don't think would necessarily be assumed to be the most exciting reading, but the bylaws and the minutes and the correspondence, trying to understand what were the kinds of practices that these organizations were using when it came to bringing private dollars together and devoting them to something that was called already in forms of tax law, the public good. So that was like one piece of the research to really kind of piece together these practices. And then as soon as it was clear to me, so the federal income tax is passed in 1913, and this starts a whole other kind of trajectory of thinking about how philanthropy works, because it becomes defined by tax law in really interesting ways. And I'd never thought about tax law. I hardly am able to do my own taxes, right? So, but I realized, oh, this is another kind of archive. This is another set of historical documents that I have to understand. How did tax law develop, and how were different Jewish philanthropic entities interacting with it? And what I came to learn was that there were people who were working, especially lawyers who were working at Jewish philanthropic entities, who were in a real dialogue or conversation with the Internal Revenue Bureau, which became the IRS eventually, who were involved in lobbying for very specific, obscure seeming, detailed seeming things about tax law, because they had a certain kind of vision about, and this was the language some of them would use, about the government kind of freeing private money to do a better job than the government might do to provision for the needs of different groups of Americans. So it then became an issue of reading that tax law, reading congressional records and legislative histories about different changes in tax law. There emerged a really important figure, a lawyer by the name of Norman Sugarman, who was from Cleveland, who I'd never heard of. I've studied American Jewish history for a very long time, and he had never crossed my path. But I learned that he was the architect of a new kind of technology of philanthropy called the Donor Advised Fund, like a mini endowment or a mini private foundation that could be held in public charities. So I went to his papers and read, he was a very organized man, read his speeches, read his testimony to Congress about various things, his correspondence. So I was piecing together all of these different kinds of archival sources. And the last thing I'll say about sources, because I think you'll find that historians can talk forever about our sources, is that the hardest kinds to find were sources about private family foundations. There weren't tons of Jewish private family foundations until later on, until the 80s and 90s. But in general, it was very, very difficult to find those records, because I think there's a certain kind of concern about privacy among the holders of those kinds of papers. So you sometimes hit certain roadblocks and have to figure out, who will give you access and who won't.
Let me ask you this. Did much of the changes in these tax laws also happen or accelerated during the Reagan years, would you say? And certainly continuing on to the Bush years in particular, and then into Trump. Is that what the more contemporary changes are occurring?
Well, again, you ask a historian that kind of question and they'll say, no, you have to go much farther back than that. So that is my answer. One of the things that starts happening in the 50s is Congress starts to have hearings about foundations, about philanthropy. This is a time, right, when there's suspicion about private power in the United States, potentially subversive of true Americanism, right? This is a time of McCarthyism, of anti-communism. So this is part of that kind of concern. Like, are there these places where there's a great deal of capital that's being held that could potentially be disruptive of the American government? So that's really what's driving these kinds of congressional inquiries. And there are hearings, and Congress starts to say, we don't really have enough control over the philanthropic sector, and there's more and more money being put in it, and this could ultimately be fairly undermining of the American government. So from that point forward, there is a kind of political will to put into place more regulatory apparatus via taxation of philanthropy. And there's a major tax reform that happens in 1969, and it's meant to actually control and constrain the power of philanthropy. But it opens certain kinds of carve-outs that allow for things like donor advised funds, that allow for certain kinds of endowment practices, that starts us on a path of what I think is a pretty profound shift in how philanthropy operates. And then certainly in the years of starting with Nixon, but then into Reagan and forward with Clintonian policies, right, there's less and less appetite to have a high level of taxation, right? And so, the highest marginal tax rate really, really falls. It had been as high as 70, 80%, and it's falling and falling, to half that or less than half of that under Reagan. So the possibilities to have more of this kind of private capital amass, and then to have particular benefits tied to it when it's put into different kinds of philanthropic structures, expand. So even as we have a progressive tax system in name, right, where if you make the most, you're taxed the most, the way that the philanthropic sector works with exemptions is if you make the most, you stand to benefit the most from a tax exemption. And this ends up being a way in which philanthropy actually kind of dollar for dollar, as I say, really enriches the wealth or the money of a wealthy person's philanthropy.
Yeah, and how does this get sold? I love your term, depoliticizing politics. How does this get sold to the general public? How do we come to believe all of this? And this term that you have here, depoliticizing politics. How do we do that? What does that mean?
So this is all happening in the same kind of period when there's a gaining kind of prominence for ideas of the free market, right? And of course, these are, contested ideas, right? Because you have New Deal and Great Society programs that are saying, the American state has to give certain kinds of social welfare benefits to its population. But at the same time, you have rising, libertarian economic thinkers who are saying, no, the best thing that government can do is let go and just free the market to do what the market will. However, even in those kinds of ideals of free market economics is actually a great deal of sort of baked in policy that it's not really the government just sort of like, letting what may happen with the market happen, but there are particular efforts to get the government to really subsidize private interests, to subsidize, certain, whether it's forms of real estate development, right? To basically subsidize capitalism, right? Mm-hmm. is the way that we can think of it. So part of what I talk about as the depoliticization of philanthropy is tied into these kinds of ideas that, philanthropy as well should be this kind of space that is free from too much government interference. And it's this kind of, idealized realm of civil society where just the public good will be met. And this kind of sense that is magnified by rules that the IRS puts in about what kinds of political behavior and political speech are allowed for philanthropic entities to engage in, and how to kind of regulate that. This kind of notion that philanthropy operates somehow above or beyond politics, which, on one hand becomes a sort of formal rule to get 501c3 status, but it also ends up crafting an incredibly narrow vision of what would be, the kinds of disqualifying political behavior that a philanthropic entity could engage in. So what I show in the book is all the ways that in profound ways, Jewish philanthropic organizations are political as can be, are lobbying Congress, are involved in presidential administrations, are fundraising for particular policy agendas, and are still kind of stepping away from kind of owning their politics, owning the fact that they are involved in particular organizations and forms of power.
Right. That gets us into the issues of race, doesn't it? And identity issues, and plays out in programs like the Birthright program. I wonder if you could touch on that to continue what you've been talking about just now.
So one of the shifts that I trace in the book is a shift from what I call material need-based philanthropy. So the kind of, philanthropy that early Jewish philanthropic organizations were involved in generally had to do with meeting the needs of new immigrant populations that were coming in, who needed clothing, who needed shelter, who needed food, who needed vocational training. And that was really the preoccupation of Jewish philanthropy for its kind of first phase in the United States. As American Jews become a population that gains more access to education, to socioeconomic opportunity, and as immigration restriction really cuts off the number of newcomers coming into the United States, starting as early as really the late 19th century, there are stirrings of this, but certainly by the 20s, that kind of material need-based philanthropy starts to shift. And what I saw emerge was a kind of identity-based philanthropy, where the kind of role and purpose of philanthropy among Jews was to itself be an act of identity. So just giving money being a Jewish act, making American Jews feel connected to their Jewishness because they're giving to Jewish places. And the role of that money was imagined as creating a kind of future, right? Creating the possibility for Jewish life to continue in the United States. And that's a really important shift because it also maps on financial changes, right? Meaning that the material-based philanthropy operated through a kind of constant circulation. The money came in and the money was then dispersed out. Whereas identity-based philanthropy coincided with more possibilities to hold capital as philanthropic capital with the benefits from the state, but not necessarily to disperse it at the same rate. So identity-based philanthropy ends up, kind of investing in the idea that it could guarantee a future for the Jewish people. And it's absolutely a product of a kind of post-Holocaust, really trauma, I think. A real kind of fear. But I had somebody, as part of my research for this book, I talked to over 100 people who work anywhere, somewhere in the field of Jewish philanthropy. And I remember talking to one person who's the head of a Jewish federation in a city that used to be a larger Jewish city and, had lost a lot of population, but had a notable endowment. And I said, what do you think is the future? Like, demographers are telling us that the Jewish community is really dwindling. What's going to happen with that endowment? It's a huge amount of money. And this person said to me, as long as that endowment exists, I'm going to believe that there's Jewish life in this city. And I see that as my goal, right? That the money itself could become, I would say, kind of confused with the identity, right? So programs like Birthright are so interesting to me because, this is a really high capacity program. It takes a lot of funding, and that's a problem with a lot of identity philanthropy and why endowments were so important. It tended not to kind of have the capacity to take in as much money as might be given. Birthright expanded very quickly. It could absorb a lot of very large gifts in the same way that a hospital might or a university might. And it was entirely built around the idea that this quote unquote free trip, right, subsidized by taxpayers, of course, that trip would guarantee, it would be an investment in the Jewish future. And in a very particular kind of Jewish future, of course, and participating also in this kind of depoliticized realm without, totally thinking about what did it mean to tell American Jews that the way to think about their birthright had very little to do with America, but it had to do with this kind of dipped into experience in Israel. So a lot of different forces at work in this one kind of identity-based philanthropic funded program.
Yeah, that's a great point. I've done a number of shows actually fairly recently with Israeli filmmakers. Meyer Laushi, Kings of Capitol Hill, explores the influence of AIPAC, of course, on our own policy and Israel's. Another one I've just done is Till Kingdom Comes, and the influence of Christian evangelical money. And I'm doing one next week on King Bibi, Dan Schauder's movie, in which people like Sheldon Adelson are depicted as basically for years and years and years supporting and propping up Benjamin Netanyahu, King Bibi. So speak, if you can, a little about the connection here between American money and influence Jewish American money and its influence in Israel, and supporting certainly perhaps governments that the majority of American Jews wouldn't support, and the influence of that sort of dynamic on politics on campus, in American campuses, over the issues of Middle East, And I know you. I told you I was going to get that into questions like what happened to possibly what happened to Cornel West at Harvard.
So here's how I'll start an answer to that question.
Okay.
It's a big question, and I'm glad you're asking it. We need to be asking that question. One of the things that I'm not the first to discover, but that I certainly could not help but see, is that in many ways, philanthropy is not a particularly transparent mode of politics or economics in this country, but it's an incredibly powerful one, right? And, so what does it mean that there's a great deal of money that is held places and sometimes dispersed to places, and it's done in the name of the public, right? It's the public good. And it's done with only certain forms of transparency or access, right? So if you're doing something in my name and you're using a tax expenditure, which is my money, shouldn't I have a right to know what you're doing?
Yeah, sure.
Well, the answer is only to an extent. So one of the ways in which this is quite manifest when it comes to American Jewish philanthropy is our inability to really understand exactly how the flows of money work. And this is not unique to Jewish philanthropy, right? There are all sorts of different studies about dark money, and this is part of that, right? The ways in which money can go places without being entirely visible or traceable, even when that money is not just private money, right? It's being subsidized by the state. So when it comes to, for example, American money, American Jewish money that goes to the state of Israel, some of it we can know about. And I can say, hey, Adelson, I don't agree with the fact that, you're giving all of this money to the state of Israel. You're making certain presumptions about what American support should look like for the state of Israel, or you're kind of putting an imprimatur of, American Jews all thinking X, Y, and Z, when that's clearly not the case. So that's one thing. But there's all sorts of other ways. So if there's an organization like the Jewish Communal Fund, which is the holder of a huge number of donor advised funds, we can start to look and say, wow, every year there are allocations from those funds that go to support organizations that on many lists are designated as terrorist-like organizations that are really hurting Palestinian populations, and I think are hurting the prospects for a peaceful state of Israel. But what we don't know is whose money that is, who's funding that, right? So we can't really trace all of the different ways in which, different kinds of Jewish money are going to support different kinds of things in the state of Israel, that many American Jews might say, I really disagree with this. But if that money is flowing to the state of Israel and it's, flowing through something like the Jewish Communal Fund, it sort of puts a kind of legitimacy on the fact that, yes, this is American Jewish support for X, Y, and Z. When it comes to campus life, in a sense, there's a similar dynamic. There are lots of different new initiatives, and it's like a new one springs up every day to quote unquote, quote, fight anti-Semitism on campus. And some of these I think are very well intended, and some of these I think are being used as a proxy to put forward a very particular agenda when it comes to the state of Israel, and are frankly using our students as pawns for that. And one of the issues is I think we should be able to know, well, who's funding these things, right? Who are the people who are putting millions and millions of dollars toward these different kinds of Stop Anti-Semitism initiatives? And then, can we have a conversation about, are these the people that we think should be making these decisions and calling the shots? What kind of expertise do they have? What other kinds of commitments do they have that might be driving what they're doing that might not actually be in the best interest of campus life or even of stopping anti-Semitism? But there are so many ways in which the philanthropic sector is sort of protected from visibility. And really, if you ask me, it's one of the incredible ironies that a sector that defines itself by the single qualification of having to operate for the public good has the ability to be so obscured from the public eye.
Yeah.
And I think that's, so whether or not Cornel West, was it because of donor pressure? It would be good just to be able to have an answer, right?
Absolutely.
And then we could stop speculating. And sometimes the lack of an answer means that people say, really potentially offensive things or anti-Semitic things. Oh, it must have been Jewish donors. Well, do you know that? The problem is that we have a system in place that makes it difficult for us actually to know. And so then you can get, wild speculation or maybe accurate information, but it's not clear. So I think that is one of the most sort of damaging ways in which this system operates in our discourse currently.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned that, Lila. I was going to ask you, how do you answer? Are you concerned with the antisemites of the world coming on and looking at this, say, yep, see, Jewish money controlling this and that and this and that? Again, what would you say to them? What would your book say to them?
I have no idea. I mean, look, I was warned multiple times, sometimes quite kindly and sometimes quite nastily, that I needed to walk away from this because to talk about Jews and money was just not only inappropriate and crass, but it was just inviting haters to feel validated in their hateful ideas. And there were times when I got really worried because I don't want to be responsible for validating any kind of conspiracy theory, any kind of, violent and vicious vision that somebody who is a hateful person has. However, it has become really clear to me that, it's not the case that, if you simply just avoid certain topics, then that is somehow going to make those vile ideas go away, right? So if we just said, okay, we'll never, ever talk about Jews and money, or we'll never, ever talk about Jews and global networks of power, and then that will just, cure the problem. Well, what a delusion.
Absolutely.
Right? So
I can't agree with you more, Lila. We're having an adult conversation on this. It's about time for that. It's your work is well documented, research. I think it opens the window, and I think it's very important to do so on this. I didn't mean to cut you off on that. I just wanted to say
no. I mean that's exactly my point. That can I control how somebody's going to read what I've written? No, I can't. And I, worked really hard. And I think especially because of this, that it is this issue and it feels, potentially dangerous. I really did try to think about, everything I said. Can I document that? I write in the beginning of the book that I decided not to use the terminology of Jewish power because I realized that was a meaningless terminology to use. And I wanted to be really specific when I was talking about political influence. What did that mean when I was talking about different ways that different Jewish groups were coordinating with one another to lobby for a particular thing? What were those groups? What were they doing? Being really, really specific and careful. That doesn't mean I can control how somebody, who's hateful is going to use this. But I do think it's also interesting the ways in which certain people, who are not necessarily happy with some of the topics that I'm raising, want to dismiss it by saying, well, this is just going to fuel anti-Semitism, right? As if that's a way then to say we shouldn't talk about this.
To justify their own unwillingness to really be more transparent. I think that's very important. In the few minutes we have left, what are some of, I don't know, in your concluding chapter here, you try to talk about some possible reforms of the system. Is that possible? Resource generation, J. Len's investment network, Reinhold, and so on. So tell us, summarize some of the attempts to reform the philanthropic system. Is that possible?
So change is not only possible, it's probable. In fact, I would say it's probably guaranteed, right? Again, the kind of faith of a historian is that things change over time. So this is not going to be the system in 10 years and 20 years, right? These things do change. And the question is, what's the direction of change, and how can we look back to the past at decisions that were made and policies that happened or didn't happen, and be intentional and mindful about the kinds of changes we want to happen. So what I sketch out in that last chapter, is one initiative that is really kind of going whole hog with capitalism, and is just sort of saying, Jewish philanthropy is ultimately a kind of capitalist product. And so, from soup to nuts, let's make it adhere to the ideas of capitalism and constant growth and, investment. And that's really what J-Lens is all about. Every piece of what happens in Jewish philanthropy should be growing more capital to be, quote unquote, on mission, whatever the mission is. An organization like Resource Generation says, let's try to do away with this idea that capitalism is what's good for democracy. And that ultimately means doing away with even the possibility of the accumulation of wealth that allows for this kind of philanthropic sector, right? That, they kind of adhere to this certain logic that the only reason philanthropy exists to cure social problems is because it's a product of those forces that created the social problems. And so these are, young people who are inheriting a great deal of wealth, who feel like they want to empower communities. They don't want to act as if, this money that they happen to have inherited is theirs to exercise power with, but rather it should be given to communities to make their own decisions about how to address problems that they feel like they have. So these are kinds of extremes, but the things that I will say that I really do think are immediately important is, one, people actually learning about this system. I had very little understanding when I started this, except that I had this realization that my life was sort of steeped in this. And now when I look at things, simply to ask, who's funding this? Where is the money coming from? How can I understand, is this money or is this program being funded in a long range way, or is it in a short term way? How much freedom or leverage is the organization that's being given the grant really being given? Just to be able to ask basic questions, to know that it's my right to ask those questions because I, the American taxpayer, am subsidizing this and it's being done in my name. So I think some knowledge, I think being able to require and request of the philanthropic groups that operate, for our different communal names, right? So in this case, American Jewish philanthropic entities, that the boards more accurately reflect the diversity of, who is part of the Jewish community or communities. I think demanding more transparency beyond what is required by tax reporting. So I think there are a lot of things that are, really quite doable if we are able to sort of approach this sector with a spirit of curiosity and with a sense that it should be working for us, that it is our system. And if it's not working, then we should be able to change it.
Lila, you set the standard for us on this, and really the work is so needed, and it's a classic already. The American Jewish Philanthropic Complex. Thank you so very much. I wish we had more time, but I think we covered a lot of ground. Thank you so very much. And thank you so very much for your work and efforts. It's really appreciated. So, and again, next week, we will see you again on The Radical Imagination. Take care.
Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long. Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on far too long. I tell you, it's gone on far too long. Whoa. Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. Oh, somebody's poisoning the water, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on far too long. I tell you, it's gone on far too long. Oh, somebody's poisoning the water, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore.